Turn to page 394.
Orchids are easy, not difficult, just different. Some sage advice coming from Jimmy at the Highway Orchid Society. With his many years of orchid growing experience, this demonstration on the watering of orchids should be of interest to all orchid enthusiasts, be it beginners, novices, or the advanced. There'll be a short Q&A afterwards, and each of the topics covered in this demonstration we'll flesh out in greater detail in the video links dropped in the description box down below. Welcome to the Nature Company. If this is the kind of information you're interested in, please hit that subscribe button down below and that notification bell to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing.
Good afternoon. Thanks for supporting our show. I trust it's been good. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. So I'm going to talk to you about watering orchids. Okay, you've probably bought an orchid or two, or maybe you're more accustomed to growing orchids. But one of the most important aspects of orchid culture is watering. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about that today. So if we look at, typically most of the orchids that you see here today are what we call epiphytic orchids. They grow on trees or they grow on rocks. Okay, so this is a natural way in which an orchid grows. Okay, you can see the roots come out and they grow over, in this case, driftwood, or it could be a tree branch or some other means of support. That's how they grow. Okay, and so you'll understand that when this orchid gets watered, in other words, when the rain falls on it, these roots get wet, okay, but the excess water immediately runs off, okay, and the roots retain moisture in this corky white covering on the root is where it actually holds the moisture. Okay, so let me show you. I'm going to water this orchid. Okay, so it's raining, and the orchid gets thoroughly wet. Okay, so likewise, if you own an orchid like this that is on a mount, when you water it, give it a good watering. Okay, I've just given it a very light watering now, but you'll see that these roots have turned green. Okay, so that corky layer on the outside of the root, called the velamen, has absorbed moisture. Okay, but obviously the excess moisture has run off, and pretty much depending on the conditions, within an hour or few or three, that would have dried off. Okay, but the orchid is essentially a xerophytic plant. In other words, it's used to dryness. Okay, it can resist dryness, so it will absorb the moisture it needs through these roots, even though it has been wet only for a short while. Okay, so that's how epiphytic orchids function. This is just a little bit more convenient, but certainly there are people who would now take this thing and suspend it. You see it tends to fall, so you would perhaps, when you mount it, do it like that, and then the orchid would basically grow up. Okay, so that's what you want to try and emulate when you're growing orchids. Okay, for convenience sake, we grow orchids in pots. Okay, it's just more convenient. They stand nicely, you can carry them around. We grow orchids in pots. Okay, and we grow them in various forms of bark. Okay, there are other media as well. Tomorrow there will be a talk on the various types of orchid media. Okay, but bark is pretty much a good starting medium. So you get, in this case, medium-sized bark. Some plants are grown in fine bark. But you'll see that this bark here, as it's packed in here, there are air spaces in between the bark. Okay, and so the roots like this, they grow over the bark, but there is still air in the plant. Okay, and so that is the sort of fundamental requirement of orchid roots. Okay, so again, watering this plant, don't just do this, you know, like you would your African violet. Give it a good watering, let it run. Yeah, let it run out the pot. Okay, and in time, this bark will absorb water. Now that is now wet in there, and the roots can absorb that water. Okay, so that's how you water an orchid. Important thing is don't leave it standing in a dish. I often see people growing orchids, and then there's this dish at the bottom, and it's a centimeter deep in water, and that is very, very quickly going to make this mix soggy. It will start rotting, and the orchid roots will die. And orchids are tough plants, and those roots will die, and you won't immediately notice that. I mean, if you have a tomato plant or something like that, if those roots are dead, it will, within an hour, wilt. I've seen some orchids live for months afterwards with no roots, and then they slowly succumb. Okay, so then one obviously doesn't link the fact that your orchid is now dying with the fact that it hasn't had water. And the reason it hasn't had water is because the mix has rotted and the roots have rotted, so it can't absorb any water. You might be watering it every day, and then it looks a little bit, ooh, my orchid's not looking so good, let me water it some more. You're just making it worse. Okay, so the orchid roots have to go through this process of getting wet and drying out. Getting wet and drying out. Okay. The difference, of course, lies in the type of orchid. Some orchids like to dry out greatly, like an orchid like this, Sinlalia anceps. It comes from Mexico, actually. It does actually very well in our climate. It likes the warm, wet summers and the dry, cool winters. Okay, so this plant can survive on this slab here. The ones we've got in our garden at home, they haven't been watered for the whole winter. Okay, and they're looking a little bit shriveled, but they'll be fine. When it rains again, they'll bounce back. Okay, but not all orchids like it that dry. Okay, some like to be slightly moist before they are re-moistened. Okay, so the extent of drying varies, but they all have to go through this process of being wet, absorbing moisture, and drying out. Okay, and so this facilitating drying out is very important in orchid culture. So we do this in a number of ways. Okay, so a pot here, like this, obviously the roots and the mix in this pot will dry out relatively slowly because the orchid will absorb moisture and you'll get a bit of evaporation from the surface. Okay, but that's why I've cut holes into the pot. There's a little spider on my orchid as well, and I tend to cut these holes as well. Okay, that's to facilitate drainage and to facilitate the ingress of air so that it dries out. Yeah, I've got like a copper pipe, which I heat up on a gas stove and I just poke it through. Yeah. So often you'll buy orchids and they don't have these holes. So it's helpful to do that. It just aids in the aeration of the plant. Okay. All right, so here's a cymbidium. Cymbidiums are terrestrial orchids. There are some epiphytic orchids that grow in trees, but even a cymbidium that grows in trees, it will grow in the crotch of a tree. Okay, it grows there, and of course humus and organic matter and bird poop and everything accumulates in there, so it becomes a bark-like mix. Okay, or they grow in the ground, but they don't grow in soil. They grow in like a leafy humus material, which drains well. Okay, so again, the extent to which orchid roots dry out varies depending on the genus and the species, but they all have to go through the cycle. Even things like cymbidiums, which are widely considered to be terrestrial orchids, they also need to dry out a little bit before you re-water them. And so to facilitate this drying out process, we employ a number of tricks. The one is, as I've showed you here, drilling some holes. Another one is to use pots like this. Okay, if you can get them. Some of the super stores, these gardening stores carry these pots. And so the more you buy these pots, the more they'll supply them. So you can see this dries out really well. In fact, sometimes you've got to water it a little bit extra. See, so that runs out. The mix is wet, the roots are wet, and you just let the water run out. Okay, so that's been watered and will probably be all right for another week at this time of the year. Another trick you can use, you can grow orchids in a variety of things. This is a basket. Okay, the reason I grow this particular orchid is called a stanhopea. It tends to send out a flower spike which grows down. Sometimes it even grows down through the mix, or it creeps along here and it hangs down. Okay, so that's why I grow it in this basket. But nevertheless, many plants grow well in a basket like this. Okay, so I've just put some old shade cloth here. You can see how the roots populate this area. You can use coir. There's various things you can use to line this basket. You put the orchid in, and there's this bark in here. And again, this dries out very nicely because air can move through there. Okay, so you've got to adapt your watering cycle according to the pots you've got. So you would water this type of thing or this type of thing more often than you would water a pot like that. Again, but you have to kind of inspect it. You know, dig your finger in, see is it drying out, and if it is, then give it a water. This is a Epiphytic. Now you can see I'm using these. This is a chocolate mousse container, and the reason I'm using that is that I can see what's going on inside. Okay, there are some places that sell clear pots, so by all means use those. But I'm on pension now, so I'm saving money, so I'm repurposing these things. Okay, again, you see I put holes in it. I cut bigger notches out here to facilitate drainage. But this is very easy to see if this is wet. And you'll see if you look here, I watered this 2-3 days ago. You can see it's still a bit moist down here. Okay, but this would be ready for a watering. Okay, so that's another way of, this isn't very pretty, but you can always put it into a ceramic pot or something like that. Just don't let it sit in water. Big mistake. Okay, don't let it sit in water. So there are various tricks you can use to ensure that your water mix, your orchid mix aerates and dries out between waterings. Okay. The other thing is, when you water plants, try not to get too much water into this part of the plant here. Okay, obviously if you've got a big collection and you're in a greenhouse, that's more difficult. Somehow I found rain doesn't seem to be so much of a problem. I think rainwater is quite oxygenated. But obviously if there are fungal spores in the air and you get water sitting in here, that can eventually lead to this thing rotting off. It'll go brown or it'll go black and it'll just fall over. Okay. And so if you have a larger collection of orchids in a sort of greenhouse situation, what you must do, you must water in the morning, first thing in the morning. Okay, so if you do get water in here, it has a chance to dry out. Okay, and that's where aeration, air movement comes into orchid growing. Okay, so an environment like this is great because if you hang this orchid up, if you put it on a bench, you'll see there will be air movement come through. And air movement helps to dry out the leaves of the orchid and also to dry out these cavities here that can hold water. And so all of these plants are susceptible to fungus. This one hasn't got a new growth, but when the new growth comes out, you can see the leaves they form an ideal sort of cup. So you want to try and, if you can't prevent water getting in there, at least water early in the morning so that the plant and this growth has a chance to dry out by nightfall. Because what happens at night, it gets cooler and you can sometimes get rot developed there. So a lot of guys who've got a greenhouse, they might have one of these oscillating fans or something, or if you're in a drafty spot, that's great. Air movement for orchids is not a problem. It helps them dry out both the foliage and the base of the plant. So I want to show you this here. This is obviously your familiar Phalaenopsis, which I purchased a few weeks ago because I really liked the color. I thought this was a very unusual color for Phalaenopsis. But you can see here, if you look closely, this mix here is too wet and too soggy. It's starting to break down. These are all organic materials, and they eventually go through this breaking down, this composting process. Now you can see here, those roots that are green, they're probably still all right. When they dry out, they'll go white like that. But when they're wet, they're green. But you can see there's quite a lot of black roots in here. Okay, so this here is in need of a repot. Okay, and often these things, when you get them from the stores, they've they've probably come from Taiwan and they've been flown in and they've been stored somewhere, and then so they've been in this mix a long time, and these things get soggy. So you've got to watch about. So this is soggy conditions. Okay, you can see that it's just like soggy. I watered this just before the show, but as soon after the show, I'm going to cut this off and I'm going to repot this to get it into a.
You're going to cut the flower off?
Yes.
Enjoy the flower.
No, this flower will last in water probably for another month. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Especially these phalaenopsis. I'll just cut it down here. You know, some people say if you cut it up here, there's a node there, and it can grow another flower, and there's another node there. And indeed, you can see there's one coming through there. And that's.
I found if you cut above a node and it grows out, it's not nice and straight. It just comes up
Yes.
like that.
It's a survival tactic for the orchid, but I want to look after the plant so that next year I have it flowering again. If I ask this orchid, if I cut that off, then I ask it to put another flower spike on, you're going to stress this plant out, you know. So I'm going to repot it after this. I mean, this will last in a vase for a good few weeks, depending on how long it's been on the plant. But this will last for a good few weeks still. Particularly these phalaenopsis. Cymbidiums last for a long time. Cattleyas don't last so long, but some of these last for a long time. So I'll cut it off in the next week and I'll repot this thing so it gets a fresh mix. Okay. To avoid these soggy conditions, okay, orchids do not grow in the ground in soil or compost or potting soil even.
A little bit bigger pot.
I'll see how big the roots are. If there's not too many roots, I'll keep it in this pot. So that's another trick. Thanks for reminding me. Don't put this in a big pot. You say, right, I'll put it in a big pot and it can stay there for years. You put it into the smallest pot possible. The smallest pot possible. So what you've got to avoid here is this soggy conditions. Okay, because this, if I left it in here, that would rot off completely at the bottom there. It might survive. It's got some aerial roots here. The roots might say, I'm not going in there. They'll start growing all over the place. But avoid these soggy conditions. Okay. So normally a fresh bark mix will last about 2 years. And then after that, just routinely, just take it out, cut off the dead roots, put it back, and put fresh bark in. Yeah, look, what you're trying to do is resuscitate a plant. In other words, get root growth. And you can do that. But it's like if you put a bean or avocado in a bottle, and of course the roots grow, but eventually you have to put it into the ground, where, you know. And it's the same thing with this. Yeah, look, I don't know how long it's going to last in the water. I mean, if it's growing in water, but that's really unusual. Yeah. I mean, people do grow orchids hydroponically. You know, but hydroponics is also a matter of wetting it and then draining, wetting and draining, you know. So some people do grow orchids in hydroponics, but it's a lot of fuss to do. Yeah. Now, you know, you need to, I mean, you can leave a saucer there just for the day, so that, because obviously you don't want to put it back in your house somewhere on your dining room table. So, I mean, you can leave it in a saucer, but at the end of the day, just, you know, throw the water out. Don't let it sit in water. Yeah, that's fine. And if there's a thin film of water in the saucer, I mean, that'll eventually evaporate. But just don't let it pool. Don't let it puddle in there, you know. Every second or third time, I put fertilizer in. Yeah, you see the thing, if you fertilize every time, because you have this wet, dry cycle, so there'll be water here now and there'll be fertilizer dissolved in here. This dries out. So if you add fertilizer again the next time, fertilizer will remain on top of what's already in there. So eventually you get a buildup of salt, fertilizer salts here. Okay, and that overcomes the osmotic pressure in the roots, and basically the roots die then. So you fertilize them every third or fourth watering. So in between, you just use clean tap water is fine. Our tap water here is quite soft. It's not a problem. Rainwater is the best, but it's not essential. You can use tap water. German tap water is very good. And then, so what happens in between fertilizing, you have that flushing process. So don't fertilize every time. Some people fertilize on every watering, but then they use very, very dilute solutions of fertilizer. So they will look on the label and it says 1 gram per liter, they'll go to maybe 1/4 gram per liter or something like that. In other words, make it very dilute. But the danger there is a build-up of salt concentration in your mix because you're letting the mix dry out. Leaves do go yellow. You can see quite a few yellow leaves here. But you can see these are on the old pseudobulbs. For example, this leaf is, that's a sort of a fungal thing. As I say, I don't like to spray too much. If I've got a bad infestation, I'll spray, but I don't like to spray all the time. But also this is on an old bulb. Okay, so eventually you can see these leaves drop off. Okay, and before they're dropping off, they look a little bit sad for themselves. Okay, you can see here on this cymbidium as well. These are starting to go yellow, but they're on an old back bulb over here. Problem is if it's a yellow leaf on a front bulb, then you've got problems. You know. Yeah, it could be you don't have any more roots; they've rotted off. It could be a fungal infection. Again, there's many different types of fungal infections. So, but on the old plants, you can see this here. These old bulbs have now withered and died. Okay. So when I next repot this, I will cut those off. I don't like to disturb them unnecessarily. If they look happy, I leave them. But so the old back bulbs do eventually die off. You can see these will probably drop off this season. So that happens. Same with Cattleyas. You can see these are the old bulbs at the back. They're starting to look a bit sad. It's also been very dry, but because it's been cold, I haven't watered a lot. So it's got a new growth here, but that's fine. You can see the new growth is fine. There's no concerns there. And the old growths, they do look like that. They're not pretty plants. Eh? I mean, the flowers are something else, but the plant is the ugly plant if you think about it. Okay. Orchids are easy. They're not difficult, they're just different. Yeah. Don't think African violets when you think orchids. Those are plants whose roots are adapted to growing in the soil. So orchids work differently. And just think of this every time. That's where they grow. That's how they grow. That's what they like. There are exceptions, of course, but by and large, that's your model for an orchid. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean that's kind of what there is to say about orchid watering.
And if you want to see more of how other orchid enthusiasts and orchid growers go about looking after their orchids, drop us a comment in the comments down below and we'll be sure to get more content like this out to you. And thank you for watching. If you have found any of this information helpful, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button down below and that notification bell, bing bong, to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. Help us grow as we help your orchids grow.